It started with a missing 37 cents. Not the kind of number anyone else would notice, but for me, it was like finding a crack in a supposedly perfect diamond. I'd been reconciling vendor payments late one Tuesday evening, the kind of mind-numbing task that only accountants and masochists find satisfaction in, when the decimals didn't add up. I ran the check again. Same result. 37 cents gone. At first, I chalked it up to a rounding issue. Software quirks happen. But then, the next week, it was 84 cents. Then $2.15. Small things, nothing that would make headlines, but the kind of mistakes that don't happen in systems like ours. Not unless someone wanted them to. I'd been at Valorian Industries for 6 years, long enough to know how invisible accountants are in a corporation this big. Our VP, Mark Halden, called us the quiet gears that keep the machine running. It sounded flattering until you realized gears get replaced when they squeak too loud. Mark was everything I wasn't. Charismatic, loud, confident. He had that easy smile executives wear like armor, the kind that wins investors and blinds HR to his arrogance. When he walked into a room, everyone adjusted themselves, like furniture being moved to accommodate a more expensive piece. Me? I blended into the spreadsheets. That's how I liked it, until the numbers started whispering. One night, curiosity got the better of me. I pulled transaction histories from 3 separate departments: marketing, logistics, and R&D. They shouldn't have intersected at all, but the same vendor name kept reappearing: Crescent Dynamics, a small shell company, barely 2 months old, receiving payments just under the audit threshold. My pulse picked up. I ran the tax IDs through the system. Nothing. The next morning, I brought it up in our department meeting. "Does anyone know what Crescent Dynamics is?" I asked. Mark didn't even glance up from his phone. "Probably a subcontractor," he said, dismissive.
"Don't waste time on penny discrepancies, Ava."
Then, with that smirk of his, he added, "You care too much about the details." That line stuck in my head like a splinter. You care too much about the details, as if the truth itself were a nuisance. I went home that evening, poured a glass of cheap wine, and opened my personal laptop. Not the company one, they monitor those. I recreated the ledgers from memory, line by line, following the trail. Every transaction fed into something else, every decimal linked to another. It wasn't a rounding error, it was deliberate. Tiny diversions masked as administrative costs. By midnight, I had a folder labeled Anomalies 1. I sat back and stared at the screen, my stomach tight with something that wasn't fear but anticipation. For years, I'd been invisible. Now I saw something no one else did, or worse, something they chose to ignore. When I came in the next morning, Mark was in my office. He smiled, but his eyes were sharp. "Heard you were digging into Crescent," he said casually. "Good initiative, but let's not get lost in rabbit holes. We've got bigger fish to fry." He patted my desk like he was closing a deal. I smiled back, polite, practiced. But inside, I made a promise I didn't yet understand the weight of. If the numbers were hiding something, I was going to find it, and when I did, I'd make sure the world saw what he'd buried in those decimals. Because that's the thing about numbers. They never lie. People do. Profit wears makeup in our world, a dab of adjusted assumptions, a sweep of optimistic timing, and suddenly a mediocre quarter looks ready for a magazine cover. Mark strutted through those weeks like a stylist before a runway show, clipping, powdering, airbrushing numbers until they no longer resembled the tired faces beneath. The first thing that looked too pretty was the margin on his Aurora rollout. 21.4%, steady as a metronome across 4 regions that never move in sync. Real margins wobble. They breathe. They stutter. These didn't. And when I traced the inputs, I found the same vendor name pulsing like a heartbeat through 3 separate cost centers. Crescent Dynamics. On paper, it bundled services to streamline logistics. In practice, it siphoned expenses away from where they belonged and mailed them to nowhere. I asked our FP&A lead if we had master files on Crescent. She called it a highly specialized integrator and sent me a deck that explained nothing with charts that explained less. The deck, curiously, came from Mark's folder, not procurement's. When I pushed for a diligence memo, tax IDs, beneficial owners, Mark appeared in my doorway with that calm, fatherly condescension. "Ava, don't hold the parade for a confetti audit. Focus on projections." Then, lower, friendlier, "Make them sing for Investor Day." So I tuned the model to his melody. He wanted growth, I gave him scenarios. He wanted smoother variance, I tightened bands. Each time he nudged the slider a hair further. Assume the uptake curve is steeper in Q3. Normalize freight back to pre-pandemic rates. We're capitalizing pilot equipment. Move those out of OPEX. None of the requests were illegal alone, just persuasive. But the song he wanted wasn't just in a higher key. It was a different composition. At night, I started keeping copies. Quietly. I exported ledgers to flat CSVs because those carry history the dashboards can't pretty up. I printed PDFs to local, stripped of corporate watermarks, then reprinted them to break the chain of attribution. I created a folder on my personal drive called Gardening. Inside, subfolders named for plants my grandmother loved: peony, laurel, iris. Peony held vendor registers, laurel, journal entries, iris, signatures. Signatures were where the illusion turned bold. One capital requisition approving a multi-site calibration asset included our former controller's e-sign, dated 2 months after he retired. Another batch of Crescent invoices bore an approval from a regional VP whose stylus looped clockwise. In these, it looped counterclockwise. The PDF metadata timestamped a Sunday 2:17 a.m. edit from an IP block assigned to our executive floor. I went hunting outside our walls. The Secretary of State database showed Crescent Dynamics formed 8 weeks before our first payment, using a mailbox at a UPS store masquerading as Suite 412. Its agent of record matched the initials on a consulting contract I'd seen in Mark's private budget, except there the name was spelled out. Different costume, same actor. Losses didn't disappear, they reappeared as ornaments. Obsolete inventory rebadged as demonstration units and pushed into fixed assets. A software write-down relabeled platform enhancement amortization and spread across 4 quarters to dilute the bruise. He parked risk where investors never look. Footnotes dense enough to tire a litigator, sub-accounts so new the chart of accounts still smelled of fresh paint. The day before Investor Day, he called me into the war room. Slides glowed like stained glass. "Our story is momentum," he said, tapping the hockey stick on the screen. "If the data fights the story, harmonize it." The room laughed. I didn't. I watched his reflection in the glass, steady, rehearsed, as my stomach tightened into a knot I knew would not come undone soon. Investor Day sparkled. Cameras, pastries, a string quartet in the lobby, overkill as proof. Mark floated through applause, breaking down operational excellence with the ease of a man who'd practiced in front of a mirror. I clicked the next slide when he raised his hand. I smiled when the CFO nodded. I clapped when the room demanded it. And under my blazer, a small flash drive pressed against my ribs like a secret vow. By then, the pattern was undeniable. Show vendors to mop up costs, forged approvals to bless them. Losses lacquered into assets until they looked like furniture. My job, officially, was to help the illusion stand upright long enough to be believed. My choice, quietly, was different. That night, I added 2 more folders to gardening, starlight for board packets, gravel for the kind of plain, ugly exports no one bothers to fake. I copied everything twice, hashed the files, mailed a set to a safe deposit box addressed to myself from my maiden name. I wasn't ready to confront him. Not yet. The trick with perfect illusions is patience. Watch the magician long enough, and you learn where he hides the dove. I slept with the light on. Not from fear. Clarity has its own glare. Tomorrow, I decided, I would test the edges of his story. And if the gloss cracked, I wanted to be holding the truth in raw text, the way numbers prefer to speak. The day I decided to confront Mark, the office felt colder than usual. The fluorescent lights hummed above me like they were whispering secrets. Every keystroke echoed, every phone ring sounded sharper, and the air itself carried that strange stillness that comes before a storm. I wasn't naive enough to think I could outsmart him in his own arena, but I couldn't keep pretending not to see what was right in front of me. The numbers had told their story. Now it was time to see how the storyteller reacted. I caught him just before noon in the hallway outside his office. He was talking to one of the junior analysts, his hand resting casually on the guy's shoulder, a rehearsed gesture of mentorship. When he saw me, his smile froze for half a second, then returned, smoother than ever. "Ava," he said, dismissing the analyst with a nod, "walk with me." We ended up in the glass conference room overlooking the city. It was bright, sterile, expensive, the kind of place designed to make people feel small without realizing why. I laid a printout of the latest financial summaries on the table, 3 pages, neatly clipped. "I think we've got inconsistencies in the Aurora project," I said. My voice didn't shake, but my palms were sweating. "Vendor entries that don't reconcile with procurement data. Some signatures that don't match." He didn't even glance down. "You've been busy," he said softly, almost admiringly. "You're good, Ava. Too good sometimes." I waited. He finally picked up the pages, flipping through them like someone browsing a menu he'd already memorized. "You see ghosts in decimals," he said. "You always have." Then he set the papers down, folded his hands, and gave me that perfectly measured smile that never reached his eyes. "You're an accountant, not an investigator." There it was, the line that would replay in my head for months afterward. You're an accountant, not an investigator. I asked the question anyway. Then why are there transfers to shell vendors tied to your signature? He laughed, a low, condescending chuckle that sounded practiced. You think I'd risk my career for a few doctored invoices? Come on. He stood, walked to the window, and looked out at the skyline like it belonged to him. You care too much about the details, Ava. That's both your gift and your curse. He turned back, and for the first time, the charm slipped. His eyes hardened. Let me give you some advice. Don't dig where you don't belong. Numbers are loyal to whoever writes them first. The words hit me harder than I wanted to admit. I felt small, cornered, stupid. But beneath the embarrassment, something else stirred. Clarity. He wasn't denying it, he was warning me. When I left the room, my badge still clipped neatly to my blazer, I could already feel the shift in the air. By the end of the week, my hours were adjusted due to workload balance. My access to the forecasting database vanished without explanation. Invitations to meetings I'd led for years stopped arriving. It was a quiet erasure. Professional suffocation by 1,000 small gestures. I'd seen it happen to others. People who asked the wrong questions or stood too straight in front of the wrong people. Now it was my turn. The others noticed but pretended not to. In offices like ours, silence isn't cowardice, it's currency. A few sympathetic smiles, a whispered, "Hang in there," but no one spoke up. Mark's charm bought loyalty cheaper than any paycheck could. So I adapted. I smiled through it. I submitted the same clean, precise reports, knowing no one would read them. I let him think he'd scared me into obedience. What he didn't know was that every restriction he imposed just confirmed the truth. The walls he built around me were the same walls he'd built around his lies. At home, I began organizing. Every discrepancy, every document, every message. I cataloged them like an archaeologist unearthing bones. I labeled folders with neutral names, training materials, fiscal templates, old audits. To anyone else, it looked like archived junk. To me, it was ammunition. By the end of the month, I had mirrored half the company's financial structure in my private archive. Not stolen, just shadowed. I didn't know exactly what I would do with it, not yet. But I knew one thing for certain. Mark had drawn his line, and I had quietly stepped across it. The next morning, as I walked through the glass doors, I caught my reflection in the lobby mirror. Same suit, same calm face. But something was different. I wasn't just the accountant anymore. I was the threat he didn't see coming. The email arrived at 8:43 a.m. sharp. Subject line, "Immediate audit review, data integrity concerns." It was the kind of message that sends a chill through every corporate floor, short, sterile, and unsigned. Within minutes, the office was buzzing. Whispered speculation drifted between cubicles like static. Someone's in trouble. Must be about Aurora. Maybe procurement messed up. By 10, Mark had summoned the senior staff into the main conference room. I took my usual seat near the back, notebook open, pen steady, heart pounding. He stood at the head of the table, in that navy suit he always wore for crisis control, the one that made him look trustworthy to people who didn't know better. "Team," he began, voice calm and measured. "The auditors will be reviewing our books this week. Standard compliance procedure, nothing to worry about." His eyes brushed over me for less than a second, but the look said everything. He wasn't warning me this time. He was framing the stage. By noon, the auditors had arrived, 3 of them, stone-faced and quiet. They set up in the glass conference room like surgeons preparing for an operation. At 1:17 p.m., I received an unexpected calendar invite. Meeting, data clarifications, mandatory. The organizer? Mark. I walked in, calm on the outside, while my mind mapped every possible outcome. Mark was already seated, flanked by 2 HR representatives and 1 auditor. The atmosphere was too polite to be anything but hostile. He smiled faintly as I sat down. "Ava," he said, "thanks for joining. We've come across some inconsistencies in your recent reports. Data mismatches, missing ledger entries, unauthorized access logs. Could you explain?" It was almost theatrical, the way he leaned back, letting the silence stretch, waiting for me to panic. My throat tightened, but I held his gaze. "The inconsistencies you're referring to came from Crescent Dynamics transactions," I said evenly. "Entries that shouldn't exist." One of the auditors glanced at me sharply. Mark's jaw tightened for just a fraction of a second before his expression reset to its perfect calm. "That's quite an accusation," he said, "especially considering these adjustments came from your workstation." He slid a folder across the table. Inside were printouts, screenshots, transaction edits, timestamps, all bearing my username. Fabricated, of course. Clean, precise, and damning. My badge access, my login, my fall. The HR rep spoke next, her voice soft but final. "Until this is resolved, Your access will be suspended." For a long second, the room blurred. Then I nodded. Understood. They expected tears, anger, desperation. Instead, I stood, collected the folder, and said, "You'll want to cross-check those timestamps against VPN activity logs. They don't match." Mark's smirk twitched, just slightly, a tell he couldn't hide. I walked out of that room with my head high, security waiting by the elevator. My badge deactivated before I reached the lobby. The guard avoided my eyes as he escorted me through the glass doors. Outside, the November wind hit me like a slap. My reflection in the building's mirrored surface looked ghostly, pale, small, erased. But beneath the numbness, something fierce began to stir. I had backups, 2 of them. Every file, every invoice, every doctored signature. I hadn't planned to use them yet, but Mark had made the choice for me. That evening, in my apartment, I powered on my personal laptop, the one untouched by company networks, and opened the encrypted folder labeled Gardening. My fingers hovered over the keyboard. I renamed it Reclamation. Then I started building the story back from zero. Every missing decimal, every forged approval, every shell transaction that linked back to Crescent. I reconstructed months of financial deceit, layering screenshots, metadata, and system logs like threads in a tapestry. By midnight, I had enough to tell the truth in numbers, a language even liars can't bend forever. My phone buzzed. An email from an unknown address. "We know you didn't do this. Be careful who you trust." No name, no signature, just that single sentence. I leaned back in my chair, the city lights flickering through the blinds. Somewhere above me, in a high-rise corner office, Mark Halden was likely celebrating his victory, confident that the quiet accountant had been erased. But numbers, unlike people, have long memories. And I was done being quiet. I started with the bones, the raw exports no one bothers to pretty up, plain text ledgers, vendor registers, journal entry dumps. I laid them out on my dining table like evidence tags, each file name a small, stubborn fact. On the laptop screen, I rebuilt the story from zero, refusing every convenience of dashboards and gloss. If a number belonged there, it had to earn its place. Crescent Dynamics showed up like a rash. Tiny transactions, always under thresholds, threaded through cost centers that had no reason to speak to each other. I matched invoice dates to warehouse logs, then to e-sign approvals. That's where the forgery glimmered. Stylus pressure inconsistent, stroke order wrong. Metadata edited at 2:17 a.m. from an executive floor IP block. I pulled the approval chain anyway. Then the benign-looking memos that clarified policy right after each questionable transfer. Bait, hook, net. I wasn't angry. I was methodical. By midnight, the apartment felt like a lab. Lamps dimmed, blinds closed, printers spitting quietly. I created a timeline, added column notes for intent, expense diversion, loss concealment, asset laundering. I hashed every file, SHA 256 plus a duplicate using Blake 3 for speed, and wrote the digest to a notebook with the steadiness of a medic recording vitals. A chain of custody is only as strong as its dullness. Mine would be boring enough to survive cross-examination. When my eyes started to burn, I dialed a number I hadn't used in years. "Ava?" The voice was older, but the calm sat right where I remembered it. "Hi, Daniel." Daniel Price had been my first manager, stoic, careful, allergic to shortcuts. He left corporate a decade ago to join a federal agency whose name lived mostly in acronyms. The last time we'd spoken, it was about a crossword clue. Tonight, it was about a crime. I didn't dramatize. I read him my outline, vendors, signatures, capitalization of losses, and the part where my credentials had been used to plant edits I didn't make.
He didn't interrupt.
When I finished, there was a short silence, the kind that measures weight. "If what you're saying is true," he said, "you won't just clear your name. You'll make history." The words landed like a handrail on a staircase I hadn't admitted I was climbing. "What do you need?" I asked. "Proof that resists theater," he said. "Native files, metadata, consistency across systems you couldn't control, and your process. Document it like you expect me not to trust you." "I already did." "Good," he said. "Then send it. Not email. Use the portal I'm texting you. Segment by allegation. If there's a living witness, flag it. And Ava, don't sit on this alone." I almost laughed. Who would I give it to? People who don't owe the VP favors. The text arrived as we hung up, a sterile link, one-time token. I partitioned the archive into clean bundles: shell vendors, forged approvals, asset misclassification, access log anomalies, retaliation events. Inside each, a readme in my driest voice, pointing from fact to fact like trailblazes. I embedded hash lists and wrote a separate integrity memo explaining how to reproduce every fingerprint. Uploading felt like standing on a cliff and naming the wind. Progress bars crawled, stalled, resumed. 100 files, then 100 more. I added the incident timeline, the meeting where Mark staged my fall, the moment HR cut my access, the anonymous email. "We know you didn't do this. Be careful who you trust." I included that too, headers intact. At 3:11 a.m., the portal confirmed receipt. 782 artifacts ingested. Daniel called within minutes. "We're opening a preliminary. You won't hear much for a while." "I don't need to hear," I said. "I just need the truth to be louder than his voice." He exhaled a tired laugh. "You picked a loud instrument." "Stay predictable. Don't chase him. Let the records work." After the call, I printed the submission receipts and tucked them into a plain folder labeled Utilities. Misdirection by boredom. I stowed one copy in a fireproof box, the other in a safe deposit under my maiden name. Then I backed up the whole archive to 2 encrypted drives, one at home, one mailed to my sister with instructions she didn't read but promised to keep. Outside, the city was a dim aquarium. I made tea and watched the steam unravel while my thoughts settled into neat stacks, the way they do after an emergency you've trained for without knowing. There would be fallout. People would choose sides. I would lose friends who decided silence was safer than memory. Mark would smile wider, laugh louder, and insist the decimals were having a bad day. But now the ledger existed, and it wasn't in his hands. Before dawn, I wrote one last document. Statement of method. It was nothing sentimental, just a record of how I'd arrived here, decision by decision, decimal by decimal. At the bottom, I typed a single sentence for myself, not for court. Numbers don't defend you. They sit still while you point. I closed the file and let the room return to quiet. The work was done, for the moment. The truth would leave my apartment, pass through machines and men, and be weighed against performance bonuses and charm. Maybe it would be ignored. Maybe it would catch. Either way, I had placed it where spin couldn't reach it. When sleep finally took me, I dreamed of a ledger line that ran clean and straight, balancing itself without my help. In the morning, I woke to the first push alert. Federal inquiry into corporate misconduct. Sources cite internal documentation. It didn't use my name. It used my language, and that was enough. The silence came first. Weeks of it. No updates from Daniel, no calls, no cryptic messages. Just a vacuum where tension lived. I went through my days like a ghost, watching from the outside while Valorian Industries marched forward as if nothing had happened. The same elevator chatter, the same fake laughter during team calls. If anyone noticed that I was gone, they didn't say it out loud. Then, one Monday morning, the world shifted. I woke to the sound of my phone buzzing across the nightstand. 3 missed calls, a dozen messages, and one headline glowing on my screen. Federal inquiry into corporate misconduct. Sources cite internal documentation. My throat went dry. The words were neat, professional, and utterly impersonal, but I recognized the phrasing. Those sentences, those phrases, they were mine. The press release quoted internal analysis highlighting vendor irregularities and misclassified assets. They had used my wording, almost verbatim. My work was speaking in public now, wearing a suit and an agency seal. I turned on the TV. Every channel ran the same story. Valorion's stock had plummeted 8% overnight. Reporters hovered outside the headquarters I'd once walked through every morning. The anchors said things like unexplained payments, possible falsified audits, and high-level executive involvement. At noon, a live feed appeared. Mark Halden, calm behind a podium, perfectly pressed suit, eyes shimmering with controlled indignation. He said the word misunderstanding 3 times, loyalty twice, and ended with, "We will cooperate fully." His hands never trembled. He'd rehearsed that speech, maybe even before the audit was real. But I saw the sweat just under his collar when the reporter asked, "Can you confirm whether Crescent Dynamics is a vendor under your authority?" He smiled. "I'm unfamiliar with that entity." Liar. By evening, my inbox exploded, old coworkers reaching out with cautious sympathy. "Crazy story, huh? Hope you're okay." No one dared mention my name in connection to it, though some probably suspected. I didn't reply. Instead, I pulled up the live coverage again. That's when I noticed the background. Federal agents walking through Valorion's glass doors, badges clipped to belts, rolling out evidence boxes. The cameras caught everything. Executives standing in small defensive circles, pretending to check their phones. People I'd eaten lunch with, now frozen in slow-motion disbelief. The following days blurred into a rhythm of chaos. Headlines multiplied. Anonymous sources confirmed internal leaks. Investors demanded answers. An interim board committee was announced. And in the quiet corners of the internet, a phrase began circulating among analysts. The accountant's ledger. I never claimed it, but I didn't have to. The audit team's questions followed the path I had mapped, detail by detail. They subpoenaed Crescent Dynamics, then traced its payments to offshore transfers and executive expense accounts. They found falsified signatures identical to the ones I'd documented. And slowly, inevitably, the illusion began to collapse. Mark went from confident to defensive, then to desperate. His public appearances dwindled, his polished charm cracking under the weight of new evidence. Internal emails leaked to journalists, his instructions to harmonize projections, his dismissive notes to auditors, his private comments mocking compliance staff. I read them with quiet satisfaction. Every line confirmed what I already knew. He'd built his kingdom on lies, and now the foundation was giving way. 2 weeks later, I got a call from an unknown number. I almost didn't answer. "Ms. Morgan?" The voice was precise, clipped, official. "This is Special Agent Renner with the Federal Financial Crimes Division. We'd like to speak with you regarding your documentation." I exhaled slowly. Of course. They met me at a small federal building downtown. No fanfare, no cameras. Just a room with a table, 2 agents, and a cup of coffee that tasted like dust. They asked how I discovered the discrepancies, how I preserved evidence, whether anyone else assisted. I told them everything, methodically, unemotionally. When it was over, Renner closed her notebook and said, "You understand the magnitude of this case, Miss Morgan?" "I understand the math," I said. "The rest is just consequences." She smiled faintly. "You might be surprised how rare it is to meet someone who trusts numbers more than people." As I left the building, the autumn air felt cleaner than it had in months. The city moved around me, indifferent, alive. Somewhere, inside a boardroom now stripped of its power, men were panicking. Somewhere, an audit team was holding a file labeled Morgan Evidence Set. I didn't want revenge anymore. What I wanted was equilibrium, a balance sheet with truth on both sides. And for the first time, it felt possible. That night, I stood by my window watching the skyline. The lights of Valarian's headquarters still glowed faintly in the distance, though fewer now, as if the building itself were dimming. My phone buzzed with one last message from Daniel. "They're calling it Phase 2. He's the primary target." I smiled, small and tired. For months, I'd been invisible. Now the truth was walking into those same rooms, armed with subpoenas and my spreadsheets. The audit had begun, and it was no longer my secret. The morning they raided Valarian's headquarters, the sky was a colorless gray, neither dawn nor daylight, just that in-between stillness that feels like the world is holding its breath. I watched the footage from my apartment, coffee going cold in my hand. Federal agents in windbreakers swept through the glass doors like a tide. Employees stood outside clutching phones, whispering, faces pale against the building's mirrored walls. I'd imagined this moment 100 ways, but none of them prepared me for how quiet it felt. No cheers, no satisfaction, just gravity. By noon, the news anchors confirmed what I already knew. The investigation had expanded. Search warrants executed, servers seized. The phrase, "financial misconduct at the executive level," flashed across every channel. In a single day, Valarian's stock lost nearly half its value. I kept watching, waiting for his face. It came mid-afternoon, caught by a shaky phone camera. Mark, escorted through the lobby, surrounded by lawyers. He wasn't handcuffed yet, but the confidence that once filled every inch of him was gone. His shoulders slumped, his expression flat, jaw tight. The mask had cracked. When the agents questioned me again, weeks later, I wasn't nervous. I'd already told the story once. The numbers told it better anyway. They asked about the audit trail, about the anonymous edits under my login, about when I first suspected him. I answered everything, fact by fact. At one point, Agent Renner leaned forward. "When you realized what he'd done to you, falsifying logs, framing you, what did you want?" I thought for a long moment. I wanted him to know that the truth was smarter than him. Her pen paused. Then she nodded. The case built itself after that. My files became the backbone of the investigation. The auditors confirmed every forgery, every falsified expense report, every transfer through Crescent Dynamics. Once the first domino fell, the others followed quickly. His inner circle, the managers who signed off without reading, the procurement heads who looked away, all began to talk. Loyalty was cheap when subpoenas started arriving. The media called it one of the most sophisticated internal frauds of the decade. I called it predictable. Mark's entire empire had been built on charm and arrogance, two currencies that don't survive audits. When the trial began, I didn't attend the first day. Watching him in person would have felt too personal. But I read every transcript. The defense tried to paint him as a visionary undone by overzealous subordinates. They used words like miscommunication and systemic error. But then came the exhibits. My files projected on courtroom screens, my spreadsheets, my notes, my timestamps, my handwriting labeling every forged entry with neat, calm precision. When I finally took the stand, he looked smaller than I remembered.
I described what I'd found, how I'd traced it, how I'd been framed. The defense lawyer tried to rattle me, asking if I felt vindictive, if I was angry about being fired. I met his gaze and said, "Anger doesn't reconcile a ledger. Facts do." The courtroom went still. Mark avoided my eyes through most of it. Only once, when they showed the signed approvals from Crescent Dynamics, did he glance up. His face was blank, but I saw the flicker. The moment he realized I'd documented everything before he even suspected I was watching. The verdict came after 2 days of deliberation. Guilty on all counts: fraud, falsification, obstruction. The sentence would come later, but the word guilty echoed through that courtroom like an equation solving itself. Outside, reporters swarmed. Questions flew. "Are you the whistleblower? How did you uncover it? Do you feel justice was served?" I said only one thing. He mocked me for caring about the details, but the details buried him. That night, I went home to my quiet apartment. I turned off every light except one and opened the last document in my archive, a reconciliation statement I'd written months ago, unfinished. At the bottom, I added a single entry. Debit, truth acknowledged. Credit, peace restored. For the first time in nearly a year, the numbers balanced. The verdict came in spring, on a morning so clear it almost felt cruel. Sunlight spilled through my kitchen window, catching the edges of unopened envelopes, and the steam rising from my mug. On the news, the anchors spoke in calm, practiced tones. Former Valorion VP Mark Halden sentenced to 12 years for corporate fraud and obstruction. 12 years. I thought it would feel triumphant, but it didn't. Justice isn't a celebration. It's an audit of what's been lost. And I'd lost plenty. My job, my reputation, the small, quiet certainty that good work spoke for itself. But somewhere, beneath the exhaustion, there was balance. I spent that afternoon walking the city, letting the sounds of traffic and conversation blur into background noise. For months, I'd lived in hiding, first out of fear, then habit. Now the world looked different. The glass towers that once seemed invincible were just buildings again. Steel, concrete, and people pretending to know more than they did. When the agency called to tell me the case had officially closed, I expected closure. Instead, I felt emptiness. "You did good work," Daniel said over the phone. "Not many could have done what you did." "Good work," I repeated. That's all I ever wanted it to be. He chuckled softly. "You ever think about coming over to the compliance side? We could use people who see patterns the way you do." The offer lingered after the call ended. Compliance. Truth as a profession, not a fight. Maybe that was what came next. A week later, Valorion's board issued a formal apology to shareholders. Internal control failures, inadequate oversight, regrettable actions by former leadership. My name wasn't mentioned. That was fine. I didn't need it. The people who mattered already knew the story. The rest could keep pretending it had been a procedural hiccup, an unfortunate anomaly in an otherwise respectable firm. I visited the courthouse once more, quietly, without notice. The corridors smelled like paper and disinfectant. I found the room where the trial had ended and stood at the back, alone. The clerk recognized me but said nothing. The benches were empty, the lights dimmed, only dust floating through sunlight.
For months, I'd replayed every decision, each decimal, each copied file, each sleepless night wondering if I'd gone too far or not far enough. But standing there, in the silence of that room, I finally realized something simple. I hadn't destroyed anything that wasn't already rotting. I'd just exposed it to air. That evening, I opened my laptop and drafted a letter. Not to Valorian, not to the press, but to myself. It wasn't long. To the woman who believed that truth lives in decimals. You were right. The numbers don't lie, even when people do. You didn't just balance a ledger, you balanced yourself. I signed it, folded it neatly, and slipped it inside the fireproof box with my old flash drive. Then I closed the lid and locked it. A few days later, I accepted Daniel's offer. The job title read Senior Compliance Analyst, but to me, it felt like reclamation. My precision had been used once to expose corruption. Now it would guard against it. I spent the first months learning new laws, new systems, new kinds of silence. But this time, I wasn't invisible. I was necessary. Sometimes I think about Mark, about the arrogance in his smile, the way he believed charm could outshine arithmetic. Maybe he still does, pacing some sterile cell, telling himself it was bad luck, betrayal, misunderstanding. But none of that matters. Truth doesn't need belief. It just needs time. One evening, months later, I sat in my new office as the last light faded. Stacks of reports surrounded me, filled with numbers as steady and unremarkable as breathing. I ran my fingers along a column of balances, each line matching perfectly. For a long time, I just stared, letting the quiet sink in. Then I wrote a final note at the bottom of the page. In the end, the numbers always balance, one way or another. I closed the file, shut down the screen, and for the first time in years, walked out without looking back.